Fat comes in basically two forms that we care about in the human body. There's these things called fatty acids. This is a fatty acid, that's a fatty acid, that's a fatty acid. They're long strains of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen molecules. And then you bind these three together with a thing called a glycerol molecule, and you end up with something called a triglyceride, okay? Meaning three fatty acids, well, glycerol and three fatty acids. So this is a triglyceride, this thing, and this is a fatty acid. And we store fat in our fat cells as triglycerides. And the reason we do is because a triglyceride is a big thing, and it can't cross the cell membrane of the fat cell. So once it's inside the fat cell, it can't get out. And once it's outside the fat cell, it can't get in unless something breaks it down into its component fatty acids, which is what that enzyme lipoprotein lipase does. So we burn fat for fuel as fatty acids because it's the fatty acids that can cross the cell membrane. And then once they cross it, they get turned into triglycerides. So here's the way it works. Here's fatty acids outside the cell. They go through basically, you can think of it as holes in the cell membrane. This is a fat cell. Once they get inside, they get bonded with a glycerol molecule into a triglyceride, which is too big to get out. So as triglycerides, fat is fixed in the fat cells. So anything that breaks down a triglyceride into its component fatty acids will help fat get out of the fat cell. And anything that promotes triglycerides so that they get fatty acids into triglycerides work to keep fat here. So here's where that whole energy in, energy out counts. What you want to know is we get fatter if more fat goes into our fat cells than comes out. That's where the laws of thermodynamics are meaningful. And what you want to know is what forces drive fat into the fat cell and keep it here, and what forces drive it out of the fat cell and let it get out and get burned for energy, okay? Whoop. And the answer is the hormone insulin is what drives fat into fat cells, okay? And this is a kind of complicated diagram, and I apologize for it. It's from a 2010 textbook, last year's textbook, Metabolic Regulation, A Human Perspective by a guy named Keith Frayne at Oxford University. He's the world's leading expert on fat metabolism. And here's our fat cell. And all you have to know is, it says insulin plus. That means insulin stimulates this process. So here are all the processes that tag as a triglycerol, that take fatty acids from outside the cell and turn them into triglycerides inside. You see insulin plus, insulin plus, insulin plus, insulin plus. And then you see an insulin minus here, which is where the triglycerides are breaking down into fatty acids so they could get out. So insulin suppresses that process, but it increases all the processes that turn the fatty acids into fat and stick them there. So in 1965, Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Bursons, they put insulin as the principal regulator of fat metabolism. Actually, you know, these European scientists vanished in the 1930s, 1940s, and then it took until 1956 before we needed two technologies to figure out what regulates fat accumulation in fat cells. One of them was invented in 1956. The second one was the way to measure hormones in the bloodstream was invented by Yalow and Burson in 1960. And as soon as they did that, within 2 or 3 years, it was obvious that insulin regulates fat accumulation, okay? Here's the suppression of fat mobilization. You know, again, if you want to get thin, you've got to get fat out of your fat cells. And basically, insulin suppresses, it's the only meaningful hormone that suppresses fat mobilization. So as Yalow and Burson put it, if you want to get fat out of your fat cells, what you fundamentally have to do, it requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. You've got to get insulin down to get fat out of the fat cells and burn it for fuel. By the way, Yalow won the Nobel Prize for this work. Again, it's not obscure diet book quackery. Burson would have shared it with her, but he died before they gave it to him. So insulin can be thought of as a fattening hormone. That's what this means. Insulin fundamentally works to put fat in your fat tissue and keep it there. And this has been known, I'm going to skip this slide, it's not that interesting. But we'll get to this one. This one is interesting. This is from a 2002 textbook. I'm going to translate it to you. It's called The Action of Insulin on the Adipocyte. An adipocyte is a fat cell. And it says, The overall action of insulin on the adipocyte, on the fat cell, is to stimulate fat storage and inhibit mobilization. So it's to stimulate putting fat in your fat cells and to inhibit getting it out. And it says the remarks of locally injected insulin on the accumulation of triglyceride, that's fat, into fat cells are graphically illustrated. And this photo is of a woman who developed type 1 diabetes when she was in 1941, 17 years old. And she injected herself daily over a period of 47 years with her insulin shots in 2 places on her thighs, here and here. So just by injecting insulin into her thighs, she gets these huge fat masses. And it took, 40 years for those to grow up to that size, so she probably didn't notice it while it was happening. But it's the same thing that happens to us when we secrete insulin or too much insulin, is we accumulate these fat masses. So this adiposity 101, as I call it, as bottom line, here it is. When insulin is secreted or chronically elevated, fat accumulates in our fat tissue, okay? And when insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissue, the fat depots shrink, and we burn these fatty acids for fuel. And we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet, okay? In 1965, the American Physiology Society published an 800-page handbook of adipose tissue metabolism. They basically, all this research that had been done by biochemists and physiologists about how we regulate our fat tissue. Remember I said they started in 56 and by 65 was pretty much wrapped up. And they wanted to take all this research, put it in one place so your doctors could understand it. And the editor of that was a fellow named George Cahill, and he put it to me, he said, carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat. That's kind of the message of the 800 pages. And the funny thing is, again, when I lecture to med schools about this, nutrition departments, I get this far and they're with me and they think this is kind of cool, it all makes sense. And then I get here and they start to think, wait a minute, he used the word carbohydrate. This is that Atkins crap. Okay? And I can literally see the doctors, like they just immediately zone out. Like now, okay, he's a quack. He had us for a while, but he's a quack because he mentioned carbohydrates. Atkins came along in the 60s, was getting fatter, and he read the research literature. A lot of researchers did. And he said, hey, carbohydrates driving insulin is driving fat. I wonder what happens if you get rid of the carbohydrates. Okay? This basically says carbohydrate is driving fat. If I get rid of the carbohydrates, right, insulin levels will drop, fat will come out of the fat tissue, which should, and then I should lose weight. So he tried it and he lost weight, and then he prescribed it to he was working, I think, at AT&T, if I remember correctly, and there are all kinds of fat executives who said, how come you lost weight, Bob? What'd you do? And he said, well, I didn't eat carbs. So they tried it and they lost weight, and then he wrote a diet book, and the rest is history. It became quackery. The interesting thing is that until the mid-1960s, the conventional wisdom around the world was that carbohydrates were uniquely fattening. Okay? British Journal of Nutrition, this sentence was the first sentence in an article by one of the 2 leading British dietitians. And it said, every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. This is a piece of common knowledge which few nutritionists would dispute. This is what my mother grew up believing. I mean, Dr. Spock's Baby and Childcare, 6 editions from 1946 to 92, about 50 million copies of the Bible of child rearing in this country had this sentence in it. It never changed. The amount of plain starchy foods, cereals, breads, potatoes taken is what determines, in the case of most people, how much weight they gain or lose. Okay? This was the conventional wisdom. It began in like 1825 at least, when the Frenchman named Jean-Anthelme Brillat-Savarin wrote what was for a long time the most famous book ever written about food, The Physiology of Taste. And he said, I've been eating for 30 years. I've had 500 conversations with obese, overweight people, and they all tell me how much they crave carbohydrates. This is what makes you fat. And he said, sugar makes everything worse. In the 1940s and 1950s, if you went into a major medical research hospital and you were obese, they would put you on a carbohydrate-restricted diet. Okay, this is Harvard Medical School, Stanford Medical School, Cornell Medical School, would all put you on a diet like this. This is actually from a British textbook called The Practice of Endocrinology by Raymond Greene, who's the brother of Graham Greene, the famous author. Raymond Greene was the most prestigious British hormone specialist. And the diet is foods to be avoided. It was pretty simple. Bread and everything else made with flour, cereals including breakfast cereals, potatoes, Foods containing sugar are all sweets, and you can eat as much as you like of the following foods: meat, fish, birds, all green vegetables, eggs, cheese, fruit, except bananas. Except for the fruit, this is the Atkins diet. Okay? You don't eat these foods because these foods are fattening, and by the 1965 we knew why. They stimulate insulin secretion, which stimulates fat accumulation. You can eat as much as you like as these because they're not fattening. It's that simple. Okay, some foods are literally fattening, and those foods are carbohydrate rich and they're sweet, and other foods aren't. So the conclusions, if you just pay attention to nothing else, just the physiology of how we regulate our fat tissue, you would say this. This one I try to get doctors to accept, and sometimes I succeed. More often than not, I fail. Obesity is a sort of fat accumulation, not energy balance. Fat accumulation, and that can't be controversial. There was a nutrition at Tufts on Wednesday who tried to make it controversial, but I don't see how that statement can be controversial. Fat accumulation is regulated fundamentally by insulin and dietary carbohydrates. Carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat. That's not controversial. Okay? Everyone, people agree that that is true. And the only non-pharmaceutical remedy is to restrict or remove the causative agent, which is the carbohydrates. That's controversial. That's quackery. Okay? When I tell you don't eat carbs because they're fattening, the fact that they're fattening isn't quackery. When I tell you not to eat them, it becomes quackery.